Margaret Ellison had spent 11 years climbing toward this exact table. She remembered the paralegal desk in the copy room where she'd started. The years of junior associate work that ate every weekend. She had the promotion to senior associate that finally let her exhale. Tonight was the firm's annual partners' dinner, held in a ballroom dripping with gold leaf and crystal. And for the first time in her career, Margot had been seated at the head table, close enough to the named partners that everyone in the firm would notice, close enough that her husband's presence beside her felt, for reasons she hated admitting even to herself, like a variable she couldn't fully control. Emmett Cole had never once made her feel embarrassed. That was the truth Margot would return to, again and again the weeks after that night. He was steady in a way she'd loved since the day she met him. A man who ran his own small woodworking shop on the west side of the city, who came home smelling of cedar and varnish, who could talk for an hour about the grain of a walnut board with the same quiet passion other men reserved for stock portfolios. He'd worn his one good navy suit that night, pressed carefully, his hands scrubbed pink at the knuckles, though the sawdust never fully left the lines of his palms, no matter how hard he scrubbed. Margot had watched him fasten his cufflinks in their bedroom mirror an hour earlier and felt unmistakably proud of him. It was Richard Voss, the firm's most senior named partner, who changed the temperature of the room. He'd had 2 glasses of champagne by the time the enter-yes arrived, standing to make an informal toast to the associates who'd been promoted that year, working the table with the easy charm of a man who'd never once doubted his welcome anywhere. When he reached Margot, he raised his glass warmly enough to Margaret, who outworked half this firm to get here, and the table murmured its approval. Then his eyes drifted to Emmett, and something in his expression shifted into the particular curiosity powerful men reserve for things they've decided are beneath them. "And what is it you do again?" Voss asked, not unkindly exactly, but with the practiced condescension of a man who already assumed the answer wouldn't matter. Margaret's never quite explained. "I build furniture," Emmett said simply. "Custom pieces, tables, cabinetry, some restoration work." A beat of silence, and then Voss laughed, a short, genuinely amused sound that made 2 associates further down the table laugh reflexively along with him, the way people do when they're not sure if it's safe not to. "Furniture," Voss repeated, turning the word over like it was a punchline he hadn't expected to be handed so easily. "Well, someone's got to build the tables the rest of us sit at, I suppose." Margot felt her face go warm, not with anger at first, with the specific, awful discomfort of watching someone she loved get quietly diminished in front of people whose opinions she'd spent a decade trying to earn. She opened her mouth to redirect the conversation, the way she'd learned to redirect difficult depositions, but Voss wasn't finished. "I only ask," he continued, warming to the small cruelty, now that it had landed, a laugh, "because it's rare to see one of our associates married to someone in," he paused, choosing the word with visible relish, "a trade. Refreshing, really. Very grounded." The woman beside him, elegant in emerald silk, gave a soft, uncomfortable smile and said nothing. A junior partner across the table, a sharp young attorney named Desmond Okafor, who had always struck Margot as decent in a firm that didn't always reward decency, shifted visibly and opened his mouth as if to intervene, then seemed to think better of it in front of the man who controlled his next promotion. Margot reached for Emmett's hand under the table. He didn't need rescuing. She could see that in the calm, faintly amused patience in his expression, the same patience he brought to a difficult piece of wood that wasn't behaving the way he wanted it to. But she needed, in that moment, to be the one reaching. "Richard," she started, careful, measured, the tone she used when she needed a partner to back down without realizing he'd been asked to. "Emmett's work is..." "It's all right," Emmett said quietly, and set his hand over hers, and the gentleness of it stopped her mid-sentence more effectively than any argument could have. He looked at Voss with nothing but calm, unhurried interest, the way he might study a piece of furniture someone had brought him to repair. "Can I ask you something, Richard?" Voss, mildly surprised to be addressed so directly, gestured with his glass. "Of course." Do you know the Whitfield conference table? The one on the 40th floor. Black walnut, 42 feet. The one everyone photographs for the firm's annual report. Voss blinked. Everyone knows that table. Harold Whitfield had it commissioned before I made partner. Cost more than most people's homes, from what I understand. I built it, Emmett said. 6 years ago, before Margot and I were married. Harold came to my shop himself. Didn't send an assistant. Didn't send a decorator. Sat with me for 3 afternoons, going over the grain pattern because he wanted the wood to tell a specific story about the firm's history. We picked the walnut together from a tree that had come down in a storm in Wisconsin. I still have the sketches he approved, in his own handwriting, in a drawer in my shop. The table had gone very quiet. Not the earlier quiet of people unsure whether to laugh at different quiet. The kind that happens when a room realizes it has misjudged something. It assumed it already understood. That's not possible, Voss said, though the certainty in his voice had thinned considerably. The table came from some firm and I was told it was a design house. Whitfield and Marsh Furnishings, I believe. That's the name of my shop, Emmett said, without a trace of triumph in his voice, which somehow made it land harder than triumph would have. Whitfield, because Harold insisted the piece carry both our names on the maker's plate underneath. And Marsh, because that was my grandfather's name. And he taught me to work wood in a shop half the size of this ballroom. Harold said the table should say who actually built it, not just who paid for it. He said that mattered to him. Desmond Okafor, across the table, was the first to break the silence, and he did it with something that sounded almost like relief. I remember Harold talking about that commission, he said. He mentioned it at my second interview. Actually, said it was the proudest addition to the building in 30 years. I had no idea it was you. Margot watched. Voss's face worked through several expressions in quick succession: disbelief, calculation, the particular discomfort of a powerful man, realizing he has embarrassed himself in front of people whose good opinion he also, quietly, needs. To his credit, when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost its earlier smugness entirely. I owe you an apology, Voss said. That was a poor joke, and it was made worse by being wrong on top of being unkind. It happens, Emmett said, and meant it, because that was who he was. A man who didn't need to make anyone suffer for their mistake, to feel that his own dignity was intact. Most people don't think about who builds the things they sit at. I don't mind that. I just mind when someone decides the answer doesn't matter before they've asked it. It was Harold Whitfield himself, 81 years old, technically retired, but still occupying an honorary seat near the head of the room. A man whose name was literally on the building, who rose from 2 tables away and made his way over, his wife on his arm in dark navy silk, moving slowly but with obvious purpose. He'd overheard enough of the exchange to understand exactly what had happened. Emmett Cole, Harold said warmly, extending a hand that Emmett rose to shake properly. I wondered if I'd ever get the chance to introduce you to this room myself. I've been telling people about that table for 6 years, and none of them ever asked who built it. That's always bothered me more than it should. It's good to see you, Harold, Emmett said, and something in the older man's face softened further at being remembered so easily. This young man, Harold said, turning to address the table at large, his voice carrying with the unhurried authority of someone who had built the entire institution. They were all sitting inside, spent 3 afternoons with me arguing about grain direction, because he refused to let me choose wrong, just because I was paying for it. I've commissioned art from people with gallery representation in 4 countries. None of them cared as much about getting it right as this man did. I'd put his hands up against anyone's in this room, present company included, myself very much included. The laughter that moved through the table this time was warm rather than cruel, the kind of laughter that repairs a room rather than fracturing it further. Margot felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't fully realized had been clenched. Not embarrassment anymore, but something closer to the pride she'd felt an hour earlier, watching. Emmett fastened his cufflinks, expanded now to fill the whole room. Later, after the dinner had moved into its looser, post-dessert rhythm, Margot found a quiet corner near the tall windows, and Emmett found her there. 2 glasses of wine in his careful hands. "You didn't need to say all that," she said softly, taking the glass. "You could have just let it go, you always do." "I was going to," he admitted. "But then I looked at you, and you looked like you wanted to fight everyone in this room on my behalf. And I figured the kindest thing I could do was save you the trouble." She laughed, the tension of the evening finally breaking all the way through. "I wasn't embarrassed of you, Emmett. I need you to know that." "I was embarrassed of him. I know," he said simply, and pulled her gently closer, the calluses on his palm rough and familiar and warm through the thin silk of her sleeve. "I've always known the difference." Desmond found them there a few minutes later, apologizing quietly for not speaking up sooner, and Emmett waved it off with the same easy grace he'd shown Voss, not because the moment hadn't mattered, but because he'd learned long ago, in a workshop that smelled of sawdust and his grandfather's patient instruction, that dignity wasn't something other people could take from you unless you handed it to them yourself. Harold and his wife stopped by once more before the evening ended, and Harold pressed a card into Emmett's hand. "A commission," he said, "for his granddaughter's wedding. A dining table this time. Something that could hold a family for the next 50 years. The way the conference table had held a firm's history for the last 6. Emmett accepted with the same unhurried seriousness he brought to every piece of wood that crossed his workbench, already turning the idea over in his mind, already picturing grain and joinery before the ink on the card had fully dried. Voss approached them once more too near the coat check, his earlier bravado replaced with something more careful. "I meant what I said about the apology." He hesitated, then added, with what seemed like genuine effort, "My father was a machinist. I haven't thought about that in longer than I'd like to admit." Emmett nodded, unhurried, and extended his hand again, and Voss shook it like a man setting something down he'd been carrying too long. Driving home that night, Margot reached over and rested her hand on Emmett's knee, the city lights sliding past the windows in long amber streaks. 11 years, she said quietly, and I still learn something new about how good a person you are at least once a month. "You built your career with your mind," Emmett said, glancing at her with the small, warm smile she'd fallen in love with a decade earlier. "I build mine with my hands." I never understood why anyone in that room thought those were different kinds of work. "They're not," Margot said. "I just forgot that for about 10 minutes tonight. I won't again." He reached over and took her hand off his knee, laced his rough fingers through her smooth ones, and held on the rest of the way home. 2 different kinds of careful work, built by 2 different kinds of hands, holding the exact same thing steady.